Have you ever stopped to look around at how strange our modern daily routine actually is? We wake up, sit at a table to eat, sit in a metal box with wheels to travel to a larger glass box, and then sit perfectly still staring at a glowing screen for 8 or 9 hours.
And then we genuinely wonder why we feel a lingering heavy brain fog by mid-afternoon. We treat it like a mystery, or maybe just a lack of caffeine. But the reality is far more profound. We are living through a massive evolutionary mismatch.
Exactly. We treat physical movement like it's an optional subscription service, something you do for 45 minutes in a gym to burn calories or look good in a swimsuit. But the latest neuroscience is pointing to something entirely different, something almost shocking. What if movement isn't just a side activity to keep the body healthy? What if movement is the very foundation of human intelligence?
It's a paradigm-shifting concept. For decades, we separated the mind and the body. We thought of the brain as this isolated supercomputer sitting in the skull doing all the complex math, while the body was just a fleshy vehicle designed to carry the brain from one meeting to another. But evolutionary biology tells a completely different story. The brain didn't evolve to do abstract calculus or write poetry. It evolved to solve the immensely complex problem of moving through a dynamic, unpredictable environment.
So, you're saying that the act of navigating a forest, tracking an animal, or balancing on uneven terrain is actually what forged our cognitive abilities in the first place.
Precisely. Think about what survival required for early humans. It demanded hyper-focused spatial awareness, precise physical coordination, rhythmic timing, and the ability to recognize complex patterns in a fraction of a second. Every single one of those survival mechanisms required movement. The neural architecture we use today to solve a complex engineering problem or write a piece of software was originally built to calculate the trajectory of a thrown spear or map a safe route home. The body literally taught the brain how to think.
That completely flips our understanding of intelligence upside down. It means intelligence isn't just in our heads, it was forged in our muscles and joints. But how does that actually translate biologically? If I'm moving my arm or running, how does that physical action connect to higher level thinking?
It comes down to the motor cortex. We used to think the motor cortex was just a simple command center, like a switchboard that just sends signals to your muscles saying, contract or relax. But recent imaging shows it is far more integrated than we ever imagined. The motor cortex is deeply entangled with the prefrontal cortex, which handles our executive functions, attention, and memory.
Wait, so the part of the brain that controls a bicep curl is actively talking to the part of the brain that plans for the future?
Exactly. Because complex movement requires the exact same foundational skills as complex thought. Think about it. To move fluidly, your brain has to sequence actions, adapt to sudden changes, and anticipate what's going to happen next. When you are moving, you are constantly training the brain's ability to predict and adapt. Those are the exact same neural pathways you use when you are forming a logical argument or solving a puzzle. Movement is a continuous, real-time workout for your cognitive networks.
That makes so much sense. It's like physical coordination acts as the blueprint for mental coordination. If you stop moving, your brain essentially stops practicing how to sequence and predict.
And the biological consequences of stopping are measurable. This brings us to one of the most fascinating discoveries in neuroplasticity. When we move, especially during sustained aerobic activity, our bodies produce a molecule called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
I've heard of BDNF. People sometimes call it miracle grow for the brain, right?
That's a brilliant way to describe it. BDNF is a protein that acts like a fertilizer for your neural networks. It promotes the growth of new synapses, helps form new memories, and actually protects existing neurons from stress and premature aging. And here is the critical part. The primary trigger for releasing BDNF is physical movement. Exercise literally expands your brain's capacity to remodel itself.
So we aren't just pumping blood when we run or dance. We are biologically upgrading our cognitive hardware.
Beautifully stated. The moving body creates the adaptable brain. Without that kinetic trigger, the brain becomes less plastic, less resilient, and far more rigid.
This perfectly explains a historical phenomenon I've always been curious about. And if you look back at history, so many of the greatest philosophers, writers, and scientists were obsessive walkers. They didn't sit at desks to get their best ideas. They walked for miles.
Yes, the pacing philosopher is a very real, very biological phenomenon. Walking is a rhythmic, bilateral movement. When you walk, you are engaging both hemispheres of the brain in a synchronized rhythm. This increases circulation and oxygen delivery, of course, but it also does something magical to our sensory integration. It puts the brain into a state where it can freely associate ideas.
Almost as if the physical rhythm of walking creates a rhythm for our thoughts. It clears the static.
Exactly. You are occupying the motor networks just enough to quiet the anxious, over-analytical parts of the brain, allowing the creative, subconscious networks to connect disparate ideas. The brain simply thinks better when it is in motion.
Which brings us to a rather terrifying realization about the modern world. If movement is the catalyst for neuroplasticity, creativity, and executive function, what exactly is happening to us when we sit absolutely motionless for 10 hours a day?
It's a profound biological crisis. When we adopt a completely sedentary lifestyle, we are essentially depriving the nervous system of its primary food source. Environmental interaction. Blood flow drops. Mitochondrial efficiency in the brain decreases. The production of BDNF plummets.
So, the brain fog people feel at their desks isn't just tiredness, it's the brain literally powering down because it assumes nothing important is happening.
That is exactly what is happening. The human nervous system evolved to expect a movement-rich environment. If you are sitting perfectly still for hours, your brain interprets that stillness as a signal to conserve energy. It dials down your cognitive bandwidth. A stagnant, motionless body gradually produces a stagnant, motionless mind.
That is incredibly sobering. We've engineered our entire society around convenience, completely unaware that physical friction and movement were the very things keeping our minds sharp.
And it goes even deeper than just staying sharp. Let's look at the cerebellum. It's a structure at the back of the brain, often called the little brain. For a long time, medical textbooks said the cerebellum was strictly for physical balance and motor control. But modern neuroscience has uncovered something astonishing. The cerebellum contains more than half of all the neurons in your entire brain.
Wait, more than half? Just for physical balance? That seems like massive overkill.
It would be if that's all it did. But we now know the cerebellum is heavily involved in language processing, emotional regulation, and cognitive flexibility. It turns out the cerebellum is essentially a prediction machine. It evolved to predict where your foot is going to land when you take a step. But over millions of years, that same predictive machinery was hijacked to predict what words someone is going to say next in a conversation, or how a social situation is going to unfold.
That is absolutely mind-blowing. The exact same hardware that keeps me from tripping over a rock is what allows me to read a room or understand a complex sentence.
Yes, the systems governing thought and movement are not just connected, they are fundamentally the same system. Cognition is deeply, undeniably embodied.
If cognition is embodied, then emotion must be too. We always talk about mental health as if it's entirely a psychological issue, something to be fixed with talk therapy or changing our thought patterns. But if our brain expects movement, does a lack of movement contribute to anxiety and depression?
Unquestionably. Movement profoundly alters our emotional baseline. When you engage your muscles, they act almost like an endocrine organ. Contracting muscles release specific proteins and molecules into the bloodstream called myokines, which some researchers refer to as hope molecules. These travel to the brain and actively reduce inflammation, which is a major driver of depression.
Hope molecules. That is an incredible term.
It really is. On top of that, movement regulates our autonomic nervous system, flushing out stress hormones like cortisol and replacing them with dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. We evolved to process stress through physical action. If you encounter a threat in the wild, you run or you fight. The stress cycle is completed through movement. Today, we experience massive psychological stress, a nasty email, a looming deadline, but we just sit there staring at a screen. The stress has nowhere to go. It gets trapped in the physiology.
So mental health and emotional resilience biologically require physical movement. We are trying to think our way out of stress when we actually need to move our way out of it.
Exactly. You cannot always outthink a biological problem. Sometimes you have to outmove it.
This paints such a radically different picture of human potential. It makes me wonder what the future of work or even education should look like. We force children to sit still at desks to learn, which now sounds completely counterproductive. And we build corporate headquarters where the highest paid executives move the least.
It is entirely backwards. I believe the future of cognitive optimization will completely abandon the idea of the sedentary knowledge worker. We will see workspaces designed around continuous, low-level physical engagement. We are already seeing the dawn of wearables that don't just track your heart rate, but track your movement as a predictor of your cognitive recovery and brain health.
It's a shift from seeing exercise as a chore to seeing movement as the ultimate cognitive enhancer.
Because it is. The future belongs to those who recognize that the body is not separate from intelligence. It is the very foundation of it. Learning speed, creative resilience, long-term memory, they all hinge on how well we maintain our kinetic machinery.
It really makes you question the very nature of thought. Perhaps we were never designed to sit in a quiet room and think deeply. Perhaps a true human intelligence is, at its core, an act of motion.
The brain did not evolve in isolation. It evolved through rhythm. It evolved through navigation, through climbing, through running, through action. Intelligence isn't just something that happens inside your head. Intelligence is fundamentally kinetic.
A profound reminder that if we want to keep our minds alive, we have to keep our bodies in motion. The moving body truly does create the adaptable mind.